Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the very first session of our new summer series. I think it is technically summer, right? So even though school is still going on and all that, and summer is a time of change, so it's a perfect link to our new theme, which is the dynamics of change. First, let me just welcome anyone who may be joining us for the first time today. This theme of change, I wanted to just say just a brief note or two before we launch into the learning. So, one of the mottos of the conservative movement is tradition and change, and we talk a lot about the evolution of halakha, of Jewish law, to sort of meet the times and ways that still have integrity to the tradition. So I wanted to say that that's not really our focus for this series. We really wanted to think about the idea of change much more broadly than in the realm of halakha. And actually, the series was inspired by Abraham Joshua Heschel's 50th yahrzeit that we marked this year, and the change that he believed in, social change and spiritual change. That's really what prompted this series. And so what we're going to be looking at over the next couple of months is changes in a variety of realms, religious and political and personal, and asking questions like what inspires change, what circumstances are most conducive to change, who drives change or what drives change, how do we experience change and adapt to it, what Jewish values and ideas can inspire us to make change and to make the world a better place. So those are the sorts of questions that we're looking at, again, much more broadly than the question of halakha. So that will just be really a minor piece of the series, which begins today and will go through August 14th, except for June 19th, Juneteenth, we're off this year, and July 3rd. We are really pleased to have Dr. Yael Landman teaching us for the first time today. She is one of the newest members of our faculty, Assistant Professor of Bible, and her session is called Perhaps They Will Listen, Prophets and the Art of Persuasion. So this is kind of in the influencer category of themes that we were thinking about when putting together the series. Want to invite anyone over the course of the series to consider sponsoring a session at one of our 3 sponsorship levels. If you're feeling inspired by this learning with JTS's outstanding scholars, we'd love for you to partner with us in that way. And today we have an anonymous donor who has sponsored today at the Chacham level, which is the 540 level. So thank you so much, anonymous donor, for your generosity and kicking the series off in that way. And we hope that you'll inspire other participants. On that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Tani Schwartz-Herman, for a bit more information.
Thank you, Rabbi Andelman. Also so pleased to welcome you to our summer series. And just to briefly go over the format of our session, Professor Landman will pause for questions periodically throughout the session, and we'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. You can use the chat feature to submit your questions to Rabbi Julia Andelman, and during the Q&A period, Rabbi Andelman will select a few of the questions to present to Dr. Landman. Since we receive a large number of questions, we would appreciate it if you could please express your questions both clearly in complete sentences and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with either myself or Ellie Gettinger. The PowerPoint presentation including the sources were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. And so pleased to introduce Dr. Yael Landman, Assistant Professor of Bible at JTS. She is the author of Legal Writing, Legal Practice, the Biblical Bailment Law and Divine Justice. Prior to arriving at JTS, Dr. Landman taught at the University of Pennsylvania, Yeshiva University, and Drisha Institute. And so pleased to have her teaching for us today. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Landman.
Thank you so much, Tani and Rabbi Andelman. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm delighted to kick off this series on the theme of the dynamics of change. So today I'd like to share some thoughts with you about the prophets or Nevi'im in the Tanakh. In the context of our broader theme of change and agents of change, we'll consider how the biblical prophets try to communicate their messages in ways that will penetrate and will persuade, how they seek to change their audience's minds, beliefs, and even behaviors. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, whose yahrzeit was recent, has written that the style of the prophets is not just poetic, but rather is charged with what he calls a spirit of non-acceptance. The prophet does not just, quote, translate reality into a poetic key. The prophet's images must not shine, they must burn. So today we're going to focus on some of the rhetorical strategies for effective persuasive communication that the prophets adopt in pursuit of this mission. We'll also explore why the prophets need to employ such strategies in the first place. And specifically, we are going to pay special attention to examples from the books of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, and Amos or Amos. But first, by way of introduction, I'd like us to take a step back and discuss what a biblical prophet is in the first place. So what do prophets do? Now, there are a few words for what we would call prophets in the Bible. The term Nevi'im or prophets, which we have mentioned, is the plural of Navi, the most common term for a prophet in the Hebrew Bible, and which is a term that's kind of hard to translate literally. It seems to mean something to do with speaking, someone who speaks or perhaps who is spoken to. And other less common words for a prophet include hoseh and ro'eh, which both literally mean one who sees, or a seer, from the roots chaza and ra'ah in Hebrew. And note that the word prophet in English comes from a Greek word meaning someone who foretells, who tells something in advance. But is foretelling an event the only or even the primary function of the prophet? And to answer this question, we have to take a look at some of the early uses of the term Navi in the Bible, including stories in which Nevi'im or prophets feature. So we're going to start by taking a look at Genesis 20, which is a story in which Abraham and Sarah go to the town of Gerar, which is ruled by the Philistine king Abimelech because of a famine. Abraham tells the king that Sarah is his sister instead of his wife, a biblical trope that we are not going to get into right now. And then when Sarah is taken into Abimelech's house, God appears to the foreign king and tells him that he's going to die because he has taken a married woman into his home. Abimelech makes a case to God that he has not actually slept with Sarah and therefore is innocent. And God responds to him in verse 7, so if you have part of this bolded here, to restore the man's wife, since he is a prophet, a Navi, he will intercede for you to save your life. So after some back and forth, Abraham does indeed pray for Abimelech, and his prayer is effective. Abimelech's household is healed. So this is the first time that the Bible ever uses the word Navi or prophet. And what is the function of the prophet here? I mean, the function of the prophet here is clearly not to foretell, but is something more like intercession, to intercede on behalf of someone who deserves to be punished. The prophet here prays and seems to be someone who is more likely to have that prayer responded to positively than any ordinary person. And this is the same role that Abraham famously plays in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, even though the term Navi, prophet, is not actually used there. In response to God's decree about the impending destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham intercedes on their behalf. And although this ends up not being effective, we see him taking on this role here. It's a role that Moses repeatedly takes on, interceding on behalf of the Israelites. Time and time again, he saves them from divine anger after the rebellion of Korah in the book of Numbers, coming soon to a Torah portion near you. He cures his sister Miriam with prayer after she is struck with tzara'at, sometimes translated as leprosy, after speaking ill of Moses' wife, and he intercedes on behalf of his brother Aaron too. Now, with this act of intercession, we see one role of the prophet as agent of change. Through intercession to God, the prophet apparently has this special capacity to persuade God to change the course of events for humans. And of course, intercession is not the only role of the prophets. One of their primary roles, likely reflected in this speaking-related meaning at the base of this term Navi, is to proclaim what God says. So we see, for example, in Exodus 7, and I think this is actually a really interesting use of the term Navi. Here, God tells Moses that Moses will be like God, will take the role of God, insofar as Moses will be the one to actually state the content of the message, which of course actually comes from God. And he will relay it to his brother Aaron. Aaron will function as Moses's Navi. And Aaron is the person to relay that message to the Pharaoh on his behalf in this story. So here, the prophet seems to function as a kind of spokesperson for God, relating to a human audience what God says. And many, many prophecies throughout the Bible do begin with this formula of Ko Amar Hashem, thus says Hashem, the Lord God. And then comes the content of the message. This is the same kind of language that is used when human messengers are sent to other humans. So for example, when Jacob sends messengers to his brother Esau, he tells them to relay a message that begins with the words, thus says your servant Jacob. This is the same kind of messenger language that's used in prophecy. So the prophet is a spokesperson and a messenger for God in addition to the role of intercessor. And the prophet is also involved in what we can call affairs of state. So Moses, for example, is involved in lawgiving and judgment. Deborah is both a prophetess and a judge, and Samuel is as well. The prophet can also represent God at war. So Joshua famously goes out to war on God's behalf and also very much in cooperation with God throughout the book of Joshua. And once there's a monarchy, we see that prophets can take up the role of advisor to the king. So during the reign of the famous King David, for example, we see Samuel, Nathan, and God, that would be G-A-D in English, not to be confused with G-O-D, three separate prophets who all advise the king during different stages of his reign and of his life. And later on, it seems that there is this kind of position of court prophet, of prophets who are in some capacity members of the royal court and often are critical of the king. And this seems to be true, for example, in the cases of Isaiah and Jeremiah. And in biblical narrative, we also see prophets acting as miracle workers. This is especially clear in the stories of Elijah, Eliyahu, and his disciple Elisha in the book of Kings. Now, these prophets do all sorts of interesting things. They heal the dead, they feed the poor, they beat out the false prophets of the foreign deity Baal or Baal. They send heavenly fire to rain down on idol worshipers. They're very busy. And these prophets also seem to have disciples, these students of prophecy who are called B'nai HaNevi'im, literally the sons of the prophets, but likely disciples of the prophets who are training to be prophets. So there seems to be this sort of professional guild of prophets. And as prophets, Elijah and Elisha seem to be involved in affairs of state, in matters relating to kings and to warfare, but also are deeply involved in affairs of private individuals who are in need. And they don't just speak, but they're also involved in performing miracles or wonders. They're engaged in changing minds and changing actions and even in changing nature. Now, this takes us to the prophets of our prophetic books, the so-called Nevi'im Achronim, or latter prophets, which are largely filled with words of prophecy instead of having these narratives that sometimes involve prophetic characters. These prophets, apart from being called the latter prophets, are also sometimes called by scholars the classical prophets or literary prophets or writing prophets, which distinguishes them from the prophets in narrative whose deeds and only sometimes words are recorded. The exception here, by the way, at our center, as it happens, is the book of Jonah, which we read on Yom Kippur, which is primarily narrative, but which is included among the 12 prophets that are known as the minor prophets. That's beginning here with Hosea, ending with Malachi. They're minor not because of their status, but because they are very short as books. Now, these books here include many poetic or highly rhetorical prophecies that are addressed to the public at large and not just to its leaders. They tend to present a relatively broad view of history and of God's plan for the future. There is a sense of the sweeping. These prophecies may condemn people for their sins, which can relate to things like idol worship, things that we might call religious sins, or that scholars like to call cultic sins relating to worship, but also for other kinds of wrongdoings relating to what we might call social justice, relating to mistreatment of the marginalized people in society. And the biblical scholar Diana Edelman used a phrase that I like to describe this. She calls the prophets barometers of the morality of the nation at large. The prophets also warn that Israel will be destroyed if they fail to change this behavior. And these prophets try very hard to effect change. So this is what we're going to be focusing on now. Now, when considering how prophets seek to persuade, we have to also think about why they might need to be persuasive in the first place. What resistance might prophets have faced? What were they up against? In a number of narratives and prophetic texts that involve resistance to prophecy, the party that resists the prophet is often a king or a queen. Look at some examples. Now in 1 Kings chapters 12 to 13, when the united monarchy, which had been under David and then his son Solomon, splits into two separate kingdoms, Israel as the northern kingdom and Judah as the southern kingdom, the king of the new breakaway kingdom, Jeroboam or Yeravam, resists the Ish HaElohim, the agent of God, who comes to rebuke him. In 1 Kings chapter 18, we hear about Queen Jezebel killing the prophets of God. In the next chapter, she also warns the prophet Elijah that she's going to have him killed as well. And when the kings of Israel and Judah team up to fight off a common enemy in 1 Kings 22, the king of Israel expresses how much he despises a particular prophet called Michaiah son of Imlah, because the prophet always tells him that bad things are going to happen. He says, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good for me, but only misfortune, which I think is this very human moment that we see here about a prophet in narrative. Now, stories like these reflect tensions surrounding prophets that are scattered throughout the book of Kings and elsewhere. I'd like to turn now to an example from the book of Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah is a prophet of exile. He is said to prophesy during the final years before the kingdom of Judah falls and the Babylonians exile the people of Judah to Babylonia. Most of the book of Jeremiah contains prophecy. It's written in what we would consider biblical poetry, but the book is also interspersed with these really interesting, colorful narratives about Jeremiah's experiences as a prophet. And one recurring theme in these narratives is resistance to the prophet. So I'd like to spend some time examining why Jeremiah seems to face so much opposition. We're going to take a look together first at Jeremiah chapter 26. That's where part of our title came from. And this happens during the days of Jehoiakim, that's Jehoiakim, who is not the final king of Judah, but one of the last kings of Judah, before Jerusalem and the temple are going to be destroyed, and most of the Judeans will be sent into exile. So let's take a look. Now, at the beginning of the reign of King Jehoiakim, this is the word that came from God. Thus said God, stand in the court of the house of God. So this is the temple precincts, and speak to the inhabitants of all the towns of Judah who are coming to worship in the house of God, all the words that I command you to speak to them. Do not omit anything. Perhaps they will listen and turn back. The Hebrew here is v'yashuvu, which is the same language of teshuvah, used now of repentance, each from their own evil way, that I may renounce the punishment I am planning to bring upon them for their wicked acts. Say to them, in verse 4, thus said God, if you do not obey me, abiding by the teaching, and the term here is Torati, my Torah, teaching, that I have set before you, heeding the words of my servants, the prophets whom I have been sending to you persistently, but you have not heeded, then I will make this house like Shiloh, and I will make this city a curse for all the nations of the earth. Now here God speaks to Jeremiah and tells him a message to convey to the people of Judah. And let's note how very clear the text here makes it that Jeremiah is God's prophet. The very beginning, it says this word came from God. In the second verse, we have thus said God. And we don't just hear the content of the message here, but this emphasis on Jeremiah needing to say every single word that God commands him to say without leaving out a single thing. The message itself about, if they don't listen, that they're going to be destroyed, seems almost de-emphasized here in comparison with the warnings and the framing that we have about God and Jeremiah. So the message itself about the destruction that will come if they don't listen is rather brief. It uses very little imagery. And we can compare this with the amount of space that's devoted to God's instructions to Jeremiah and the way that that is characterized. And Jeremiah listens, but instead of saying more about Jeremiah's communication to the people, the text immediately dives here into their response. So continuing. In verse 8, and when Jeremiah finished speaking all that God had commanded him to speak to all the people, the priests and the prophets, and these, by the way, kind of asterisks, seem to be not prophets who are on the same side as Jeremiah, perhaps what we might call false prophets. So the priests and the prophets and all the people seized him, shouting, "You shall die." So immediately Jeremiah is mobbed by angry listeners who respond both physically, literally grabbing his body, and verbally yelling at him that he deserves to die. Now, if this seems like a very extreme kind of response, we should refer to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 20, which states that any person who falsely prophesies in the name of God should die. So this is the background that we have to have in mind when we read our story in Jeremiah, which continues in verse 9. How dare you prophesy in the name of God that this house shall become like Shiloh, and this city be made desolate without inhabitants. Now, this image of Shiloh, by the way, is referring to the location of a previous sanctuary before the temple was built in Jerusalem, which seems to be functioning, here as this kind of cautionary tale. But how dare Jeremiah say that they are going to be destroyed, that this house of God is going to be destroyed like Shiloh? And if you recall the king of Israel in 1 Kings 22, who says that he hates the prophet who always promises him doom and gloom. So here in Jeremiah, we are looking at something both similar and different. Now, the crux of the people's response is not just that Jeremiah has promised destruction, though that's part of it, but that he has promised that destruction b'shem Hashem, in the name of God. And so when in verse 11, the priests and prophets say to the officials and to all the people, this man deserves the death penalty, for he's prophesied against this city, as you yourselves have heard. Jeremiah's way of dealing with this, his response in verse 12 is, it was God who sent me to prophesy against this house and this city, all the words that you've heard. And after exhorting them to listen, he caps off his speech by reiterating this point. So again, we see now in verse 15, for in truth, God has sent me to you to speak all these words to you. Now, when we think about how Jeremiah tries to persuade his audience, we can consider not only this audience that is described in the text, which here is, we have the people and these various officials in Judah, but we can also consider other possible audiences to the text. So for example, we are an audience to the text. Generations of readers and listeners before us and after us are other possible audiences to the text. So even as Jeremiah is depicted as struggling to gain the trust of his audience in the text, the audience to the text, ourselves among them, hear repeatedly that Jeremiah is spoken to by God. He is commanded by God. He's told exactly what to say by God, word for word. He's told by God not to leave anything out. And we also hear that Jeremiah listens, and we hear all of Jeremiah's exhortations. So this kind of framing within this text highlights a central struggle that the prophet is facing. Why should his audience believe him? While it also presents Jeremiah's communication with God in such a way that an audience to the text may be more easily persuaded than the audience within it. But firstly, by narrating how God speaks to Jeremiah and how Jeremiah listens, and secondly, by inspiring compassion for poor Jeremiah, who is obeying God and trying to save his audience, and in the process is risking his life and having them attack him and promise him the death penalty. And while Jeremiah ultimately is spared within this chapter, he is repeatedly jailed and berated and physically and verbally attacked over the course of his book. Now, another way that the text sets up Jeremiah as believable is by highlighting the extent to which he does not choose his prophetic office. At the very beginning of the book, in chapter 1, the text narrates the prophet's commission to prophecy, including his initial protestations. Okay, so we're going to go now to chapter 1. So God says to Jeremiah in verse 5, before I created you in the womb, I selected you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet concerning the nations. And Jeremiah replies in verse 6, ah, my sovereign God. And the Hebrew word here for ah is aha, which is a word of woe, a word of lament. And this clues us in here to Jeremiah's tone in his response. I don't know how to speak, for I am still a boy. But God essentially tells Jeremiah that he has no choice in the matter, and also that he should not be afraid. And this is a directive that clues the reader into the fact that Jeremiah is indeed afraid, despite the fact that the only reason that Jeremiah himself offers for his resistance is that he is a boy. And the term here is a na'ar, a young boy, which may refer either to his age or to his inexperience or possibly to both. And also of note here is that according to the way that God speaks about Jeremiah's fear, Jeremiah does not seem to be afraid of God like we might have imagined. No, instead, in verse 8, God says, "Have no fear of them," in the plural, "for I am with you to deliver you, declares God." Now, already here at the very beginning of Jeremiah's book, we see that Jeremiah has reason to fear his audience. And having already peeked ahead to chapter 26, because we can do things like that as readers, we can understand why Jeremiah may have reason to fear them. Jeremiah offers a window into his own experience as resisted prophet in chapter 20 also, when he speaks about trying not to prophesy, starting by addressing God directly. So he says to God, "You enticed me, and I was enticed. You overpowered me, and you prevailed. I have become a constant laughing stock. Everyone jeers at me." And skipping to verse 9, "I thought, I will not mention it. No more will I speak in God's name. But it, the divine word, was like a raging fire in my heart. Shut up in my bones. I could not hold it in. I was helpless." Now, the people are against Jeremiah to the point where he thought perhaps he could simply not prophesy. Perhaps he could just not share what God says to him. But prophecy was like fire in his body, in his heart, and in his bones, which he could not possibly contain. And here there is this sense that prophecy may cause Jeremiah this real, almost physical distress. There is a sense here that this may go beyond the metaphoric, that Jeremiah is physically powerless to contain the words that God forces upon him. So let's unpack some of the layers of resistance at work in our text. Now, on the one hand, Jeremiah, upon being called to prophecy, resists that calling. And it's not quite because, like Moses in Exodus, he thinks he's unable to communicate well, but because he is a na'ar. He is young, he's inexperienced, and because, as God points out without mincing words, even though Jeremiah himself does not say this, Jeremiah is scared. And on the other hand, we see that Jeremiah as a prophet faces intense resistance from his audience in the text, who doubt his authenticity and who threaten him with violence and even with execution. And there's nothing Jeremiah can do but continue to prophesy, irrespective of whether he wants to. Now, as an audience to the text, we are primed by these portrayals of Jeremiah's experience to respond differently from the audience within the text. Jeremiah's resistance to accepting the job of prophet and his attempts to stop prophesying suggests to us that he's the real deal, and not just someone who is looking for fame or for glory. The emphasis on his commandedness by God, and even the duress that he faces from God, which is an interesting position for the text to place God in terms of how the audience might respond to and feel about God. All of this elicits our sympathy and our trust. We can buy in to what Jeremiah is saying. And the menacing response of the audience in the text may move us to distinguish ourselves from them by taking Jeremiah's words seriously, and in the process, opening ourselves up to the prophet's critiques. Now, I could keep going, or Rabbi Andelman, if there were questions, I can also pause for a moment, so you just let me know.
Yeah, I have a couple of general questions that I can ask. It's so interesting what you were saying earlier, thinking about, a primary definition being intercessor as opposed to necessarily kind of a loftier role. I need to chew on that more, but it makes me think that the passage that you shared with us in Exodus is really kind of mistranslated when it says, Aaron will be your prophet. It's not. Anyway, okay. So, one person asked a question about Joshua, and I'm going to just broaden it to the earlier prophets, and just can you fill us in on? Did you skip those for a particular reason? Are they not prophets in the same way? That was part of the person's question about Joshua, because they sort of act very much in and among the human world. A lot of them, is there some, they're obviously their narratives, they're sort of literarily, they're very different, but is there sort of a categorical difference in terms of how we think of them as prophets or not? You're muted, one second.
And now there we go. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Yeah, I think that's a really thought-provoking question, because when we do think about Joshua, which is a great example, if we were to think about his role and to kind of do a poll of what's the first word that comes to mind, I imagine that we would get different responses. We might get leader, we might get something about him being this kind of not descendant, but like disciple of Moses. We might have something connected to his role in warfare, so something like commander-in-chief. There are all sorts of different titles we can throw around, but prophet certainly seems to be also an appropriate description for him. He certainly has plenty of direct communication with God. So I think part of what that prompts us to do is to push ourselves, to expand our ideas about who counts as a prophet and what makes them count as a prophet. Meaning, is it primarily this kind of direct line of communication with God that distinguishes the prophet from other, leaders, whether in a political capacity, military leaders, judges, other sorts of, ruling people? Is it the communication with God that distinguishes them, or is this much more kind of a piece of many different features of what can make a prophet? And this may not necessarily remain consistent in different parts of the Tanakh. Now, I certainly did not refer to every person who might be considered a prophet in the Tanakh, just for thinking about how to use our time, because we do have limited time to discuss this pretty large topic. But I think part of the direction that we could be thinking in is about expanding our notion about what a prophet does and how these different capacities of a prophet can kind of interact with each other, and what that might mean for different audiences to prophets who are kind of inhabiting some of these different roles.
Great, thank you. A lot of people have asked about differentiating between false and true prophets, and the Torah gives us this test that's basically like, if what the person says comes true, then it's a true prophet. But that's not necessarily a useful test in the here and now. One person talked about right, someone could potentially abuse being seen in that role and saying, well, this is what God said. People could think that person's crazy. A lot of people raise that theme, so I wanted to mention that as well to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting reading through Deuteronomy 18, which we just referred to by way of one verse, without looking at the larger context, which includes this kind of litmus test for how to know if a prophet was speaking the truth or not. How do you know if it's a true prophet if what they say comes true? And how do you know if it's a false prophet if what they say doesn't come true? Which also is not exactly how that seems to work in the Nevi'im, meaning there are all sorts of warnings, and the hope is that they won't come true. So getting into what that actually can mean in practice is very difficult. And I don't think that this is a question that the Tanakh really solves for. I think this is something that remains as this kind of tension about, well, how do you know God's will? Right? That's always this very kind of large question, both biblically and post-biblically. How is anyone to know God's will? And a major answer within the Tanakh is, well, through the prophets. But that remains a very problematic answer because there remains a huge amount of ambivalence and uncertainty around knowing whether someone actually is a real prophet or not. I think that that is a tension that sits there. It's one that is negotiated in different ways in different books, but I don't think that that is one that is kind of made clear cut at any point within the Tanakh itself.
Great, that's interesting. So it's sort of a manifestation of a larger question that we might always have about religion, about morality, about what's right. All right, the last question I wanted to squeeze in now, if that's okay, is so the prophets are speaking to a certain group of people at a certain moment in time, and one of our participants points out that's not how we read them necessarily now. Some of them it's fine to read that way, but we read them often as having these universal, eternal messages. And is that sort of a faithful reading? Is there a danger to that? And how did we even start doing that?
It's a really important question. And it taps into this question of, well, what was the original intention behind this text, behind what was said in it that's being recorded or that is being written down? What is the purpose? Who is the actual intended audience? Is there one intended audience? Is it meant to be a text that ends up carrying meaning for generations to come or not? And one piece in this, I think, is just the very fact of canonization, the fact that certain works became part of the Jewish Bible, part of our biblical canon. They became scripture, literally our holy writings. They were texts that survived and that were used and that were read. And the very reading and reverence of these texts and continuation to read them as meaningful has, we might say, has made the question moot by very fact of the way that canonization has made scripture kind of eternal. At the same point, I think asking the kind of historical question of, well, was that ever intended in the first place is still a really important question to ask, because we can kind of distinguish between what has actually happened and what could have been.
Great, thank you. So why don't we continue with your text?
Great, thank you. Okay, great. Now, when we think about the prophets, we often think about these beautiful images of consolation, like these reversals of nature that are meant to inspire hope. So if the wolf and the lamb can coexist, and if the lion can become vegetarian, as the prophet Isaiah promises in chapter 11, though we're not looking at that text, then isn't there always this possibility that things will be okay again, no matter how terrible things get? Now, even Jeremiah, who more often than not lambasts his audience and warns them about, death and destruction and doom and swords and exile and all sorts of heavy things, even Jeremiah sometimes offers a kind of respite from the usual misery. Now, chapters 30 and 31 in Jeremiah are sometimes called the little book of consolation. That's a nice, long and simple translation of the German Trostbuchlein. Though, of course, the very term consolation belies our text's frame of reference or starting point from a place of terror, because consolation is consolation from. Now, just by way of background, these chapters purport to take place during the 6th century BCE. So already long after the northern kingdom of Israel, the so-called 10 tribes have been exiled by Assyria. And when in the remaining southern kingdom of Judah, the Babylonians have already exiled a very small elite subsection of the population, but the larger scale Babylonian exile of Judah is looming in the near future. So that is the point at which we find ourselves here. And by here, I mean here on our next slide. Okay, so when in this text, God tells Jeremiah to write the prophecy down on a scroll, this instruction is kind of resolving a possible logistical problem, which is how can Jeremiah, who is based in Jerusalem, offer words of consolation to the folks who have already been exiled to Babylonia? So a written record becomes the answer. And we should note whom the prophecy addresses here. So God declares, I will restore the fortunes of my people, Israel and Judah. Now, the inclusion of both Israel and Judah here is significant. And it suggests that there will be a unification of these two separate kingdoms, one of which had disintegrated already over a century earlier in the 8th century BCE. Now, our prophecy then jumps into a depiction of the terror that the audience is experiencing, utilizing a strategy of asking a rhetorical question, which is likely a familiar strategy. Now, of course, the point of rhetorical questions is to force assent. There's a required answer to the question being asked. It is not a multiple choice question. So the audience has to agree with the questioner's premise. And here in verse 6, we have this prefacing of the first question with ask and see. And while the English translation that we have here then proceeds with a statement, a surely statement, surely males do not marry young, it's actually formulated in the Hebrew as a rhetorical question, beginning with the interrogative particle, meaning the question word, im, and then continuing with a question beginning with madua, why? And these questions frame the use of a metaphor that depicts the terrified male audience as women in labor. Now, this image, which involves gender reversal, is one that the book of Jeremiah uses several times, but it's one that usually functions not just to impart fear, but also to kind of emasculate its audience in a way of ridiculing them. But here it's used differently. Instead of the metaphor being used here to land a kind of gut punch as part of a depiction of the punishment that's going to come, the prophet uses it to describe the series of events that is going to lead to the reversal of reversals, meaning, things went from good to bad, and now things will go from bad to good. So instead of pachad ve'ein shalom, instead of terror without relief, without any peace from it, terror will abate, order will be restored. Instead of serving strangers, zarim, which refers to foreign empires, they are going to serve God and David, or a Davidic king. Now, we recall this appeal at the beginning of this prophecy to both Judah and Israel. The mention of King David also reflects this, recalling an idyllic past, a time of unity, and suggests that there will be this kind of idyllic, peaceful harmony again. And if we look here at verse 8, we have this declaration by God, I will break the yoke from off your neck and I'll rip off your bonds. I want to pause on this image for a moment of the yoke and bonds, which are going to be removed. Now, prophets often use imagery from everyday life in constructing their messages. not always from, let's say, my everyday life, but from perhaps everyday life for people in a largely agrarian society. Now, we saw this example of use of labor pains a moment ago. And here, this image of the yoke and the bonds come from the agricultural realm. These were used by cattle, or really used on cattle, more accurately, while plowing in the fields. Now, in texts from the biblical world, and I include here both the Bible and also texts from Israel's neighbors, like from Mesopotamia, the yoke image was used to refer to the subordinate position in a relationship with an uneven power dynamic between a sovereign king and a vassal state, or between gods and humans. Now, these expressions of breaking the yoke and ripping off bonds are used metaphorically for rebelling, usually, against a king or against a god. But here, it's not the Israelites in this image who are breaking the yoke off their own necks from their oppressors. Instead, we see an image of God breaking this yoke off for them. So one thing that we see the prophet do here is to use a metaphor that draws on an image from everyday life that also has this kind of very rich, thick history of being used to convey a particular kind of message. And B, we see the prophet play with the usual way that the metaphor is used, adding an element of surprise that hones in on the point that God's going to make this unlikely, happy turn of events happen. And this happy reversal of fate is further described with a range of details about the return of the exiles to their land. So in verse 8, I will bring them in from the northland, gather them from the ends of the earth, the blind and lame among them, those with child and those in labor. In a vast throng, they shall return here. They shall come with weeping, and with compassion will I guide them. I will lead them to streams of water, by a level road where they will not stumble. For I am ever a father to Israel. Ephraim stands in for Israel, is my firstborn. So God will gather everyone, including members of society who are considered by the text to be vulnerable or disabled. Everyone. God will accompany them like a parent guides a beloved firstborn child, like a parent who comforts their weeping children. And here, instead of choosing to use a royal metaphor to depict the relationship between God and Israel, or a marriage metaphor, and both of these are metaphors that prophets use frequently and that Jeremiah uses elsewhere too, the prophet chooses to use the metaphor of a parent and child, which evokes all of the connotations that go along with this image, like love and protection and even gentleness. So some of what we see the prophets do here is to use devices like rhetorical questions, a series of images and metaphors, and the constructions of reversals, of reversal in gender, reversal in status, including political status, to signify the possibility of reversal in the larger fate of Israel and Judah. And we can understand how much more compelling this message is here than a message of destruction might be. But we also have to account for how the audience in the text might be receiving this kind of message. When the worst has not yet happened, it's much easier to dismiss the possibility that something is going to go terribly wrong. But when the worst has happened, it can be much harder to accept the possibility that things can improve. So the prophet therefore needs to work just as hard to persuade them that there is hope, as much as the prophet would have had to work hard to persuade them that they're terrible, things are going to be terrible, that they need to change. Now, I want to discuss a different kind of tactic that some of the prophets adopt beyond their purely oral function of speaking on behalf of God to their audiences. Now, some of the prophets also use what's called sign acts, which are nonverbal or not heavily verbal, physical actions that prophets perform in order to communicate a point. So we're going to take a look at a rather peculiar example from Jeremiah. So we're going from 31 back to 13. Okay. Thus God said to me, go buy yourself a loincloth of linen and put it around your loins, but do not dip it into water. So I bought the loincloth in accordance with God's command and put it about my loins. Now, to be clear, a loincloth is basically underwear. So God tells Jeremiah to get himself some new underwear, to wear it and not to wash it. This is what's happening. Verse 3, the word of God comes to Jeremiah again. Take the loincloth that you bought, which is about your loins, and go at once to Prat and cover it up there in the cleft of the rock. I went and buried it at Prat as God had commanded me. So God tells Jeremiah, who apparently has been wearing this underwear for however long, an unspecified amount of time, to go near the Prat River, which usually Prat is the equivalent of Euphrates, which is all the way in Mesopotamia. Many scholars think that here it's not actually referring to this faraway river in Mesopotamia, but just some remote river within the borders of Israel. But either way, Jeremiah is to go there and bury the underwear somewhere among the rocks near the river. And then, verse 6, after a long time, God said to me, go at once to Prat and take there the loincloth that I commanded you to bury there. So Jeremiah does exactly what he's told, and he finds the loincloth ruined. It was not good for anything. And now God explains the symbolism behind Jeremiah's act. The word of God came to me, it's in verse 8 and now verse 9. Thus said God, even so, or perhaps in this manner, the Hebrew is kacha, will I ruin the overweening or arrogant pride of Judah and Jerusalem, this wicked people who refuse to heed my bidding, who follow the willfulness of their own hearts, who follow other gods and serve them, etc. They shall become like that loincloth, which is not good for anything. So the divine speech clarifies that the dirty underwear represents the full nation of Israel. The whole nation is like a dirty, useless loincloth. Verse 11, for as a loincloth clings close to a man's loins, so I brought close to me the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah, declares God, that they might be my people, for fame, for praise, for splendor, but they would not obey. Now, in case Jeremiah and presumably his audience missed the point, God compares the Israelites' previous place of closeness to God to the proximity of a loincloth to a man's loins. Now, the implication here is that if the Israelites had stayed close to God like they were supposed to, then they would have enjoyed the perks of that closeness, fame, praise, etc. But instead they wouldn't listen, so now they can easily be tossed away, just like dirty, ruined underwear. Now, I think that we can agree that the prophet's dirty underwear and this image of Israel as God's underwear is a far cry from the happy image of God, the parent lovingly guiding a weeping firstborn back home, or Isaiah's image of the wolf and the lamb living together in peace. This is not what we usually think about, or not what I think most people usually think about when we consider how the prophets wax poetic. But this too is prophecy. And I mean, we should remember this too is scripture. And the question, of course, is why? Now, in considering this, we can think about the emotional effect that a metaphor produces, as well as the connotations that it engages that lend meaning to the prophetic act. When we talked about Jeremiah's protestations and the violence he faces from his audience, we talked about how these details of his experience elicit feelings of sympathy and trust. Now, I think in this case, we can say that the metaphor that the prophet uses perhaps elicits disgust. The audience may experience a kind of visceral reaction to this prophecy, a sense of feeling grossed out. Now, at the same time, underwear, which, quote, clings close to a man's loins, stands in for closeness, for intimate knowledge. So the broad societal collapse that's going on at the national level also pervades the most intimate personal spaces. There is no kind of barrier that could be erected. Now, of course, part of what is particularly uncomfortable about this prophecy is that it doesn't just deal with dirty underwear. It also suggests that Israel is supposed to be like good underwear to God. And the very juxtaposition of God and underwear seems unseemly, frankly. I mean, is this appropriate? Is this acceptable? And perhaps the very point here is to provoke the audience to kind of grab their attention, however crudely, and so to shake them from what seems to be their kind of default unwillingness to be persuaded by the prophet. So all sorts of different methods can be brought to bear on the audience within the prophet's playbook. Now, we could pause for questions, or we could kind of march right along. I see we're getting a little bit short for time, so you can let me know, Rabbi Andelman, what you think.
Why don't we keep going?
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, I will never think about that text again the same way.
So, thank you. Okay, so I want to shift now. I mean, I think if anyone has had enough of Jeremiah at this point, we're going to shift now to some examples from the prophet Amos or Amos. Now, Amos is one of the minor prophets that we referred to earlier briefly, and is less famous than Jeremiah. That's a cookie pun. Though the book of Amos actually dates itself to a couple hundred years earlier than Jeremiah, before the exile of Israel or Judah, it appears later in the order of the biblical canon. And the book of Amos is only 9 chapters long. You can compare that with Jeremiah, which comes in at a whopping 52 chapters long. So we don't get quite as much text about Amos's personal life, but we still do get some, pretty interesting glimpses into Amos's experience as a prophet, including his struggle with what seems to me be a fairly resistant audience. And in this light, we can also consider some of the strategies that he uses. So Amos opens up his book with a set of prophecies that are referred to usually by scholars as oracles against the nations. And here we go. So we have our first one here. This is written in the same structure that the next several oracles follow as well. Begins, כה אמר Hashem, thus said God, for 3 transgressions of Damascus, for 4, I will not revoke the decree. Now, I'll pause for a second. While commentaries have gone into all sorts of directions about what this for 3 and for 4 means, it most likely is an example of what scholars call graded parallelism, where we have a number and then that number plus 1, so 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which are set in parallel with each other in order to signify a whole lot of X, many X. So instead of imagining, 3 transgressions or 4 transgressions or 7 transgressions, we can just say, for the many transgressions of Damascus, which is the capital of Aram or Syria, I won't revoke the decree. And this translation here of the decree is actually doing quite a bit of work. The Hebrew here just says lo ashivenu, which means I won't revoke it. And it is not clear what it won't revoke. What won't be revoked only becomes clear as you keep reading. And this is likely intentional as a means of building suspense. So the inclusion of the decree here is helpful to the reader, but also kind of elides some of the suspense that the prophet is building here. And then we get examples of these transgressions because they threshed Gilead with threshing boards of iron. So this is kind of a cruel act of violence. And then we move to the punishment, destruction by fire, and then some. I'll send down fire upon the palace of Hazael, who is a king of Aram, et cetera, et cetera. So we have destruction, including fire. And this is the kind of pattern that we see followed in the next several pieces of prophecy in Amos chapters 1 and 2. Amos continues with these oracles against the nations. And you can see on this map, I kind of beautifully drew in numbers to give you a sense of the order. So we hear Amos. Let's imagine that we are his audience. We are Israel. Forget about being the audience to the text. Imagine that we are the audience within the text. And we hear Amos say, Damascus sinned so much, and God's going to destroy it. And the audience in Israel is kind of like, oh, sometimes Amos says that we're going to get destroyed, but now Amos is saying something about someone else. So that stinks for them, but okay. And then Amos says something similar about the Philistines. So we jump from number 1 up north to number 2 in the southwest, and on and on. And on the one hand, Amos keeps talking about other people and what is going to happen to them, which may lull his audience into this sense of safety and even sanctimony. But on the other hand, if we take a look at this map, and if we do a bit of connecting the dots, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can see that we're kind of jumping from north to south to north to south, back and forth, kind of around Israel. So the audience might be wondering, well, when is he going to stop? Might he stop at us? I mean, surely no. And then Amos hits number 7. And number 7 in the Bible and also in other places is this kind of significant, round, complete number. 7 is a number that is climactic. Lists can end. They're the number 7. And number 7 talks not about Israel, but about Judah. And we should note here that Amos's primary audience is not Judah, it's Israel. And these are 2 separate entities at this point. So talking about Judah is not the same to the people in Israel as talking about themselves. So when the audience in Israel hears number 7 about Judah, they may be thinking like, wow, that was close. But also, we're safe and we're awesome. There's nothing wrong with us. But then Amos whips out the element of surprise. There is an 8th oracle. Instead of ending at 7, he goes on. And that 8th oracle is against Israel. And this is an example of what is sometimes called the rhetoric of entrapment. How does the prophet get an audience to accept what they're saying? And the audience is not interested. So here Amos tries to accomplish this by lulling them into this false feeling of safety. He repeatedly hits them with prophecies that they can sanctimoniously agree with, only to turn the tables on them at the end. And so he prophesies, and this is part of the Haftarah for the Torah portion by Yeshev. Thus said God, for 3 transgressions of Israel, and for 4, I won't revoke it, etc. We start off following the same pattern, and there's a list of the various things that the Israelites have done wrong, which largely fall under the umbrella of what we would call social injustices. But then Amos breaks pattern. Instead of jumping straight to how therefore they will be destroyed, like the audience might expect, Amos departs from pattern to say, voicing God, meaning this is God speaking, an expression of incredulity at how the Israelites have messed up despite all the incredible things that God has done for them. Meaning this isn't just wrongdoing in a vacuum, this is wrongdoing that is a betrayal and that is shocking in the face of all of God's kindnesses. Yet I destroyed the Amorites before them, whose stature was like the cedar trees, and who was stout as the oak, destroying his boughs above and his trunk below, or better, and his roots below. Shorash shav is the word in Hebrew. Now, here the Israelites' enemies are compared to these mighty trees, the cedar and the oak tree, as a means of demonstrating just how great God's destruction of them was. And we have an example here of what's called a merism, which is a literary device where two polar ends of one entity are mentioned as a way to signify a totality. So, when I say that someone was covered from head to toe, it means their entire body was covered. Or if you say that something was done from A to Z, it means an entirety. So he mentions here the highest branches above and the lowest part of the tree, the roots, reflecting totality, meaning God's acts on behalf of Israel were all encompassing. And we have these references here to historical kindnesses, including also in the next verse, the Exodus. And then we get to verse 11. I raised up prophets from among your sons and Nazarites, Nizirim, from among your young men. Is that not so, O people of Israel, says God? So God established people who could guide Israel, including prophets who could communicate God's message to them, and Nazarites who would have adopted certain restrictions, including not consuming grape products and various other details that we won't get into now. But verse 12, you, Israel, made the Nazarites drink wine, which is precisely what they are not allowed to do, and ordered the prophets not to prophesy. Now, although Amos does not specifically say here that the audience told him not to prophesy, the fact that he's a prophet who is prophesying this message to them suggests that he would have faced precisely this kind of resistance from them. And this is something that we see play out later in his book in chapter 7. We'll see if we have some time to take a quick look at that. If we don't, you have it in the sources, which you can keep. But for now, I want to take a look at what follows this in chapter 3 in Amos, where the prophet employs a number of persuasive strategies in order to reach his audience. Specifically, we are going to look chapter 3, verses 3 to 8. Can two walk together without having met? Does a lion roar in the forest when it has no prey? Does a great beast let out a cry from its den without having made a capture? He continues until verse 7. Indeed, my sovereign God does nothing without having revealed the purpose to God's servants, the prophets. And finally, in verse 8, a lion has roared. Who can but fear? My sovereign God has spoken. Who can but prophesy? Now, each verse here proceeds in a tight logical progression. Every cause has an effect. Every effect has a cause. Could A have happened without B having prompted it? Could C happen without D resulting from it? Like we saw in Jeremiah, Amos uses rhetorical questions as a means of gaining his audience's agreement. And the examples that Amos uses in these questions are empirically observable phenomena that his audience could perhaps attest to. So every statement that Amos makes, primarily in the form of questions, requires his audience to agree with him. He keeps asking them these questions, and they just have to keep nodding. Now, Amos starts with this kind of general question about can two walk together without having met up, which doesn't specify what kind of two we are talking about. He shifts into the animal world, to the kind of interface between animals and humans, to the human realm, to the human divine interface. And finally, he gets to the climax of his speech in verses 7 and 8. God doesn't do anything without having warned the prophets first. And therefore, just as when a lion roars, it automatically causes fear, isn't it the case that when God speaks, the prophet must prophesy? Now, as readers, we can see here how Amos builds up a response to the people who are quoted in chapter 2 as telling the prophets, do not prophesy. To this, Amos replies with this kind of very methodical, logical, poetic argumentation. God has spoken. How could I not prophesy? And I'd like to take just a very quick look at another example in chapter 7 before we pause for some final questions and wrap up. We have this further somewhat famous, I guess in a niche way, example of the prophet Amos' struggle with a resistant audience that comes up in chapter 7. Now there is this series of vision reports that spans chapter 7 and 8, and I brought for you here just the first 3, which come before a narrative interlude, which is what we are going to jump to when Amos is confronted by a priest for the king of Israel. Okay, now what's important here, because we're going to kind of jump ahead a little bit, is that at the end of these 3 visions, which have this kind of progression of, God shows Amos a vision, which refers symbolically to Israel's destruction. But in the first 2, Amos is able to intercede, and God says, okay, fine, I won't destroy them. But in the 3rd, the destruction is irreversible. God tells Amos that there's nothing that can be done to change it. And the way that this vision ends is by referring to the ruin of the house of Jeroboam with the sword, and to the destruction of both religious centers and royal centers in the shrines of Isaac, the sanctuaries of Israel, and the house of Jeroboam. And this Jeroboam is a second King Jeroboam. We mentioned the first King Jeroboam of Israel earlier. So this is a different person, no relation, it seems. But at this point, Amos gets interrupted. Now, this is where we have this confrontation between Amaziah, the priest of Bethel. Bethel is Beit El. Take a look at our map here. It's right here, kind of at the border between Israel and Judah, but at the very south of Israel. So Amos, we happen to know from the first verse in the book, is from Judah, but he prophesies in Israel to Israel. So we have this liminal figure, Amos, who kind of straddles the border between Israel and Judah, who is prophesying in Israel. And here's what happens now. So Amaziah, this priest, sends a message to the king to tell him, Amos is conspiring against you within the house of Israel. The house of Israel here gives us a sense that Amos is speaking publicly. And the country cannot endure the things he's saying, for Amos has said that Jeroboam is going to die and Israel shall be exiled from its soil. So Israel's going to be destroyed. And this isn't exactly what Amos said here verbatim, but it is kind of the sense of things that Amos has been saying. So exactly what that means is, an interesting question that we can table for now. And then in verse 12, Amaziah, the priest, turns directly to Amos and he says, seer, and the word he uses here is choseh, not navi, off with you to the land of Judah. Earn your living there and do your prophesying there. But don't ever prophesy again at Bethel, for it's a king's sanctuary and a royal palace. So here, Amaziah tells him, go back to where you came from. You are not wanted here. And then we get Amos's response here. I am not a prophet, and I am not a prophet's disciple, literally a son of a prophet. I'm a cattle breeder and a tender of sycamore things. And now, of course, Amos is a prophet. And he says as much in the next verse. He says, but God told me, go prophesy to my people Israel. So that's what I'm doing. But his point here is perhaps that the priest has accused him of earning his keep as a prophet here in Israel. And he says, go earn your money somewhere else. And Amos says, this isn't about money for me. This isn't something that I am doing in order to captivate an audience and somehow earn my keep. No, I am doing exactly what God has said to me. This isn't something that I signed up to do, and this is something that could make us think of Jeremiah. It's something that can make us think of Moses, this kind of protestation that grants legitimacy to the prophet. Instead, God said that I have to do this. This isn't my occupation professionally. This is just me following God's orders. And then he caps it off with, also, you're going to be punished very badly. Now we can consider in this background, this kind of resistance that Amos faced that we see alluded to in chapters 2 and 3. And we see here the sense that Amos is being resisted by the leadership, though there is this kind of sense that Amos is being received by the public, meaning he is conspiring. Conspiracy in itself implies other parties. Within the house of Israel, people are listening to Amos. And we can consider why the people who would have been so resistant to Amos's messages earlier in the book, when it comes to this prophecy, seem to be eating up what he says, or at least might have, a willingness to listen to him. And in this context, we can think back to our king of Israel back in 1 Kings chapter 22, who referred to a prophet who he doesn't like, says, I hate him because he always says bad things are going to happen to me. And we can think about Amos's audience. When he says that bad things are going to happen to them, they don't want to listen to him. But when he turns to speak about, something bad that's going to happen to their king, suddenly they can listen. This is very similar to what we see earlier in the book, where Amos kind of draws in his audience in Israel by speaking about other people. And I think, part of what we can observe here is that it is much easier to listen to someone else's message of critique and of what might go wrong if they don't change. It's much easier to hear criticism that is geared at someone else than it is to hear a message that is directed at ourselves, saying that we must change. And this is the kind of uphill battle that our prophets are facing, that makes them need to draw on so many different tools for persuasion. It is much harder to be open to criticism about oneself and to be willing to change. We can just ask Jeremiah or Amos, whose words couldn't just shine, they had to burn. So thank you very much. And I believe that we have about 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you. Well, I really couldn't help think about how, all of the parallels to today and people trying to get other people to hear their messages, to sort of lull them out of a sense of security or boredom or wherever they are. And some of the techniques that you talked about really stood out. When you were talking about merism and sort of this, it brought to mind immediately the first they came for the socialist remarks. Right, they're only coming for Damascus and these other places. What you were just saying just now about how resistant people are to hearing messages of doom and gloom, and Yehoshaphat being much happier without this prophet who doesn't say nice things, right? And that also, I think, is such an obstacle to getting people to hear your message, right? Like getting people to notice when there's a problem and step up to keep it from turning into an emergency is very hard. And also the metaphor, when you talking about the dirty underwear, I was thinking about metaphors like lipstick on a pig that just are very easy to understand. They're not sort of high and lofty. Anyway, those are some of the associations I was making. And I wonder, as someone who's really an expert in this, what techniques do you most kind of see around you in the world, from among what the prophets, pull out of their quiver successfully or unsuccessfully. Connie, we have to unmute her.
There we go. Thank you. I sometimes ask students, if there were prophets today, how do you think they would communicate? And I guess it's kind of the sign of a generation that the most common response in recent years has been through TikTok, when I might have expected them to say through Twitter, honestly. But I think that, thinking about the way that social media is a platform for people to get out their messages, and also a primary way that people consume messages and get influenced. And I know you mentioned this idea of prophet as influencer earlier. And it's a little bit of a, funny or loaded kind of comparison to consider in this context, because it looks like the prophets are trying so hard to influence. And the question is, with how much success? And when we think about modern day influencers, we might think about people who have kind of passed a certain threshold. Once they have passed a certain threshold of followers, that it becomes almost too easy for them to influence. But I think that considering the power of social media here is kind of a powerful comparison for what prophecy might have mutated into in a kind of equivalent in terms of reaching audiences today. I also want to mention that when we're talking about biblical prophecy, we can envision these kind of sign acts as being very visual in an original context. And we can also think about how these texts, even as texts, have been read and still are read in liturgical contexts and other contexts. But we can also just think about how we usually engage with them as texts, and how images can also be incredibly powerful, which I think is part of why this idea about the prophet's dirty underwear is kind of so shocking and striking. And I think that the modern day use of images, both static but also a video, also has a large role that's played in the context of, change and influence.
That's really interesting. I know we only have 1 minute left. I'll just throw this in for your short response. There were a few questions around, it's somewhat related to what we asked before about how do you know if a prophet is true, but in this case, forget social media and TikTok, but dialing back a little bit, how did some prophets have staying power? Why are some more quoted in the liturgy? Why were some canonized and others weren't? Someone mentioned that there's so much evidence for influence of the zodiac, but those are not, right? Those types of seers or people who foretold things were not canonized as prophets. Any sort of quick comment on that issue?
I mean, it's a really, really interesting question. And I think, it gets into a whole broader conversation about which texts were written down and who copied them and how were they preserved and how much was done intentionally and how much was kind of accidental. But one interesting window, I think, for thinking about this question is to look at what texts have been uncovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran and at other sites in the Judean desert, and to see which texts were copied numerous times that survived. And of course, there could have been texts that were in use then that just didn't survive. And of course, famously, like Scroll of Esther is not attested at Qumran. It's still part of our canon. It's still part of every, canon of the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament. But there are other works that are there too. So thinking about what texts were written down, were copied, were read out loud, were perhaps performed either liturgically or otherwise, and that were received in this way. I mean, I think it's a huge question. It's an interesting question that I think needs kind of a longer treatment.
Well, we'll have to have you back then. Thank you so much for teaching us today. I think this is a really interesting way to start the series, to think about how people try to spur change and the different techniques that they use. How to make friends and influence people, as one might say. But really, obviously, they're trying to make much greater change than that in the words that they employ. So thank you so much for teaching us for the first time and today, and hopefully in the future. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Thank our anonymous sponsor once again for your generosity, and I hope that everyone joins us next week. So I neglected to say at the beginning that our series has kind of a chronological orientation. So for the next month or so, we're going to be dwelling in ancient and rabbinic times, and then make a quick stop in the medieval period, and then look at a lot of modern phenomena. So so we hope that you join us on that journey. Thank you again to Professor Landman, and have a great week, everyone.